The Pirate King. Episode 12. The Cell. They didn't make a scene, and that was the first thing Sam Jensen noticed. Not because it surprised him, but because it confirmed something he had already started to understand before the bars ever closed behind him. The quiet, the absence of reaction, and the way everything moved without friction. Like it had already been decided long before he ever stepped into the space that led him here. There were no lights cutting through the dark, no raised voices, no unnecessary movement, no attempt to turn the moment into something visible. That was something that could be interpreted from the outside as anything other than routine. Because that was the point. Not just containment, but invisibility. It was a process that existed specifically so that nothing about it would stand out. Nothing that could be pointed to later. They made it so that nothing required explanation, and Sam recognized that immediately. Not as a detainee, but as someone who had spent years watching it happen to other people. He understood it worked from a distance, but never expected to experience it from the inside. He didn't resist when they guided him forward, didn't ask questions that wouldn't be answered, and didn't slow his pace or try to change the direction of something that was already moving exactly the way it was designed to move. Because there was nothing real to fight. Not yet. Not without understanding what had actually been set in motion. Reacting too early would only give shape to something that still didn't fully exist. Not in a way he could define. The holding area was smaller than he expected, and that wasn't a mistake either. It wasn't an oversight in design or a limitation of space, but a choice. It was something built to feel temporary, transitional, like a place you passed through rather than stayed in. And yet the moment he stepped inside, that illusion collapsed under its own weight because nothing about it felt temporary at all. It was clean in a way that went beyond maintenance and beyond routine care. The surfaces had been wiped down to a level that removed any trace of prior use. And it was cold in a way that didn't come from temperature alone, but from absence. There was the lack of anything personal, anything that connected the space to a specific moment or a specific person. It was just a cell that existed to hold, to contain, to isolate without ever needing to explain itself. The cell doors closed behind him with a sound that echoed and lingered on long enough to mark the moment as something that had weight. That was what stood out the most. Not the sound itself, but the way it ended. Immediate, final, like a decision being made without discussion. And Sam stood there for a second longer than necessary. Not because he didn't understand where he was, but because understanding it from the inside required a different kind of acceptance than observing it from the outside ever had. He had spent years moving people into spaces like this, watching the shift happen in their posture, their breathing, their focus. And now he felt that same shift pressing in around him. He didn't show that he was overwhelmed. He kept that settled in quietly and stayed. He moved to the bench without rushing, lowering himself into it, elbows resting against his knees, hands coming together naturally. Not clenched, not loose, just held in a place as he leaned forward slightly. His eyes unfocused for a moment before settling somewhere neutral. Somewhere that didn't pull his attention too far in any direction. Breathe, he told himself, not out loud, not even consciously at first. Just a rhythm he fell into automatically. the same way he had learned to do on patrol. The setup was clean, and that was the part that didn't sit right. Not because it was unexpected, but because it was precise in a way that removed randomness from the equation entirely. Every piece in place, every step justified just enough to hold up under basic review, but not enough to explain why it had happened when it did, or why everything had aligned at that exact moment. Keller had been there with the kind of certainty that didn't come from reacting to a situation, but from already knowing how it would unfold. Sam leaned back slightly, his shoulders touching the wall behind him as he tilted his head up just enough to look at the ceiling. He wasn't searching for anything, just giving his eyes somewhere to rest while his mind worked through the sequence again. Slower this time, more deliberate. "This doesn't make sense," he said quietly, the words barely carrying beyond where he sat. Not meant to be heard, not meant to start anything. Just a statement that existed because it needed to. Because ignoring it would mean accepting something that didn't fit. But even as he said it, he knew that wasn't entirely true, because it did make sense. Just not in the way it was supposed to. Not in the way a real case developed. Not in the way evidence built naturally over time. This had been constructed, not discovered, shaped into something that looked real enough to act on. It had been documented just enough to justify the process that followed, and that realization settled in deeper the longer he sat with it. Not all at once, not in a way that changed everything immediately, but in layers, each one reinforcing the last. Keller hadn't built a legitimate case, and that was the part that mattered most because a case could be challenged. It could be questioned, broken apart piece by piece until it either held or collapsed under its own weight. What Keller had built was a moment, something designed to exist just long enough to create an outcome, and something that didn't need to stand up over time because it wasn't meant to last. He created it to play out just long enough to move Sam from one position to another, from outside to inside, from control to containment. And once that happened, the truth itself didn't matter anymore. Sam closed his eyes for a second, not to block anything out, but to bring the sequence back into focus without distraction. He was replaying each step without rushing, letting the details surface on their own. The assignment had been simple on paper, clean. There was nothing that required extended analysis or deep investigation. Just a follow-up, something routine and something that fit within the boundaries of normal work. That was what made it normal, because nothing about it raised immediate concern. Nothing that would justify pushing back or asking for clarification beyond what had already been given. The case was given to him. The location had been ready, and his response was immediate. All of it aligned in a way that removed friction from the process. The more he walked through it in his mind, the clearer it became that none of it had happened by chance. Not the timing, not the coordination, and definitely not the presence of the right people at the right moment. "This was planned," he said under his breath, the words settling into the space without resistance. There was no one there to challenge them, nobody to confirm or deny his situation. He sat in quiet stillness, the kind of environment where time stretched without direction, the minutes losing their shape, hours blending into something that didn't move forward so much as it existed in place. Back in the shop basement, DJ didn't notice the alert right away. The system had been steady, nothing odd, nothing forcing attention. He was halfway reviewing a separate thread when it came through. Not loud, not flagged in any official way. A quiet line appeared where it shouldn't. Internal custody event. No public record. DJ's eyes moved to it without changing anything else. He didn't touch the keyboard. He didn't react. He read it once, then again. The details were minimal. That was the point of the channel. Subject ID, timestamp, division tag. DJ's expression didn't change, but his focus did. He moved then, one hand sliding to the keyboard, bringing the system fully into view. Not rushing, but not hesitating. "All right," he said quietly. "What happened?" He moved through the layers, tracking the timing, the sequence, not the surface. He wasn't looking for activity. He was looking for changes. It didn't take long. The path showed itself. A redirect. His redirect. DJ leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he followed it through. The structure held. The containment logic was intact. Nothing had been broken. His plan to frame color was in place. But then an alert popped up. "That's not right." He ran it again. Entry. Response immediate. No delay. No verification. DJ stopped. Just enough for the thought to land. Someone had seen it. And instead of removing it, they had changed it. He traced the route again, slower this time, not forcing anything, letting the system show him where it bent instead of where it held. There, the path still existed, but it didn't lead to where it was supposed to. "That's not where it goes." His hand moved again, faster now, pulling the access trace tied to the route, tracking the interaction point, the moment the system completed. The timestamp matched up to the custody alert. The identity loaded. DJ froze. No reaction, just recognition. Sam Jensen. He didn't set that up, but the connection was already there. Sam's not my target. It meant one thing. It had been redirected. Not by the criminal IT division, but by someone inside it. DJ's jaw tightened slightly, the focus locking in as everything else dropped away. The details were clear. Sam wasn't near it. He was in it, and it had already completed. DJ moved fast now, not rushed, but precise. He didn't trace the path again. He overrode it. He directed the containment layer to collapse. Hold state disrupted. Custody flag deleted. He didn't break anything. He moved through it. Exactly enough to change the outcome. Nothing more and nothing visible. The system settled almost immediately. Quiet again, like nothing had happened. DJ leaned back slightly, his eyes still on the screen as the alert cleared. No escalation, no continuation. Which meant it worked, but the realization didn't move with it. He then thought, I did this to him. But that wasn't supposed to happen. Not through that path. Not from what I built. To Keller, not to him. DJ sat there lost in thought, because the part that mattered wasn't the system. It was who redirected it. And it wasn't even how it happened. It was the fact that it had. And his son had been Keller's perfect scapegoat when it did. After long silent hours in the cell, someone came to the door. Not entering, not engaging, just checking. There was a brief pause that confirmed his presence before disappearing again. No conversation, no explanation, just a process continuing exactly the way it was supposed to. Sam stayed still on the bench because movement didn't serve a purpose yet. Not until he understood what he was dealing with. And that understanding wasn't going to come from pacing or forcing conclusions that weren't ready to form. His thoughts shifted, not away from the situation, but deeper into it. They moved past the surface details into something less defined, something that didn't connect immediately but stayed present anyway. That was when his mind went somewhere else, not intentionally, not as a distraction, but as reflex. He shifted slightly on the bench, not restless, not uncomfortable, just adjusting his position enough to reset the physical tension that had built without him noticing it. His hands unclasped and then came back together again in a way that felt natural. It was something to anchor himself while his mind kept moving. Keller. That was where the focus needed to stay, because he was the only variable that had shown intent. He was the only one who had operated with that level of bias from the beginning. Everything about him pointed to that, not just over the situation, but over the outcome. And that was what Sam kept coming back to. Not the evidence itself, but the motive behind it. Keller didn't give any chances, not to Sam. He had stood there like the result had already been reached, like the steps in between were just formalities. Something to move through rather than something to evaluate. And that wasn't how real cases worked, not at this level, not in a division where everything was supposed to be layered, verified, cross-checked before action was taken. Sam leaned his head back again, letting it rest against the wall. His eyes closed for just a second longer than before as he replayed that moment specifically. Not the arrest, not the movement into the room, but Keller's presence in it. The way he had positioned himself, the way he had watched without reacting, without adjusting, like he had already seen this version of events play out before it ever actually happened. "That's not reaction," Sam said quietly, the words coming out more as a realization than a statement. "That's placement." The distinction mattered. Reaction followed movement, placement created it. If Keller had been reacting, there would have been variation, hesitation, something that suggested the situation was unfolding in real time. But there hadn't been any of that, not even a hint of it. Everything had been aligned from the start. The timing, the access, the presence, all of it moving in a way that removed uncertainty from the equation entirely. That meant the situation hadn't developed. It had been constructed. Sam opened his eyes again, his focus sharpening slightly as though the thought settled into something more solid. Something that held up under a second pass instead of falling apart the moment he pushed on it. Constructed meant intentional. Intentional meant controlled, and controlled meant there was a point to it beyond the surface. It was something that wasn't immediately visible, but was still driving the outcome from underneath. He leaned forward again, his elbows returning to his knees, his hands clasped together as his posture shifted back in that same position he had taken earlier. The one that let him think without distraction, without giving anything away. If this had been about a case, there would have been a follow-through. Questions, statements. Someone would have come in by now. Not to release him, not to resolve anything, but to build on what had already been set in motion, pushing the process forward into something that could hold long enough to matter. But that hadn't happened. The check at the door had been exactly that, a check, nothing more. No attempt to engage, no interest in extracting information or reinforcing the position that he had been placed in. That meant this was not about holding him. It was about putting him here. For what? He asked quietly, not expecting an answer, not needing one yet. He just let the question exist long enough to shape the next step of his thinking. Because arresting him without purpose didn't make sense. That meant whatever this was, it wasn't finished. It wasn't even close. Time moved again, but it didn't feel like it had direction. Not forward, not backward. Just a stretch of existence that didn't require him to do anything except stay where he was and continue working through what he could without forcing the rest. At some point there was a sound. Not loud, not enough to pull his attention immediately, but different. It was distinct from the background quiet he had settled into. Footsteps, slower this time, deliberate in a way that suggested intentional rather than routine. Sam didn't look up right away. He let the sound come closer, let it define itself before reacting to it. His posture staying the same, his expression unchanged as the steps stopped just outside the door. There was a pause, brief but noticeable. The kind that usually meant someone was making a decision, adjusting something before acting on it. And then the door opened. "Get up," the voice said, neutral, controlled, not aggressive, not controversial either. Just instruction delivered without weight. Sam lifted his head slowly, his eyes settling on the man in the doorway, taking his stance, the lack of urgency, all of it reinforcing what he had already started to understand. This wasn't escalation. This wasn't progression. It was transition. "What for?" Sam asked, his tone even, not challenging, not passive either, just a question placed where it needed to be. The man didn't answer directly. "Processing's done," he said instead, his voice carrying the same neutral tone, like the words themselves didn't require explanation. "You're being released." Sam didn't move right away. The statement didn't line up with anything that had led to this moment. Not with the structure of the setup, and not with the level of control that had been applied to get him here in the first place. Release without follow-through didn't make sense. Not unless this had never been about holding him at all. "Released," Sam repeated, not because he hadn't heard it, but because saying it out loud gave him a second to measure the reaction that followed. "Yes." "That doesn't make sense either." "Not my problem," the man replied, already stepping back slightly, creating space for Sam to move forward whether he agreed with it or not. Sam stood slowly, his body moving before his thoughts had fully settled, his mind already shifting again, adjusting to the new variable, the sudden change in direction that didn't resolve anything, but instead opened something else entirely. "No charges?" he asked as he stepped toward the door, his eyes still on the man, watching for anything that might give more than the words themselves. "Not at this time." That was wrong. Not just unexpected, but wrong. Everything about the setup pointed to escalation, to something that would carry forward long enough to create real impact. And cutting it off here, clean, without explanation, didn't fit that pattern at all. It wasn't due process. Sam stepped into the hallway, the space opening up around him again in a way that felt different now. Not because it had changed, but because he had. The perspective shifted just enough to reveal something that hadn't been visible before. The same path he had been brought through now existed in reverse, and he walked out the same way he had entered. Steady, measured, not rushing toward the exit, but not lingering either. His mind was moving too fast now to settle into a single line of thought. Pieces shifting, connecting, breaking apart again as he tried to reconcile what had just happened with what should have happened. The gap between those two things widening the more he looked at it. No charges, no explanation, no reason given that held any weight beyond procedure. And that meant someone had stepped into a situation that had already been set, already moving, and changed the outcome without changing the structure that had created it in the first place. That wasn't something that happened by accident. That required access and authority, or something else entirely that didn't fit into either of those categories. The release process was odd. No papers to sign, no official dismissal, just an escort out of the building without a word. Sam stepped outside, the air hitting him in a way that felt sharper than it should have. Not colder, not warmer, but different. He stopped just beyond the exit, not turning immediately, not moving forward either. He stood there just long enough to let the moment settle into something he could work with instead of something that was still moving around him. No charges, no explanation, no reason. He looked back once, not at the building itself, but at the space it represented, the controlled environment that had just let him go. Then he turned forward again, his focus narrowing as the question finally set into place. Clear, defined, unavoidable. Who? Because someone had just reached into a situation that had already been closed and opened it. And that wasn't random. That wasn't procedural. It was intentional. Sam stood there for a second longer, the answer just out of reach. Close enough to feel the shape of it without being able to see it clearly yet. And for the first time since this had started, the uncertainty didn't feel like something he needed to resolve immediately. It felt like something he needed to follow. Not yet, but soon. Coming soon, episode 13, The Ride.